Hello everyone. It's me, Settlers Lament here, and I'm here with Charlemagne. We're going to be discussing Moldbug's most recent article and also an interview that he gave on with a group called Tech Wars. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That's what we're going to be discussing today. Hey Charlemagne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello. Yes. So I've been on here with you before, of course.
Yeah.
I'm Charlemagne. I make mostly neo-reactionary YouTube videos, and I've done a couple of streams lately. I actually have a live streams playlist on my channel now, and I'll add this one to it as well. So if anyone wants to see the past stream or other streams that I've done, feel free to check that out. Yes, so looking forward to this discussion.
Okay, cool. So the two things that we're discussing, the article just came out a couple weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago probably now. It was on the Wuhan flu, and it was discussing. Ironically, it was claiming that America wouldn't shut down travel, which happened just several hours after Moldbugs
Mhm.
um, sent the article to the group he's publishing with the American Mind. So he was incorrect on that prediction, though I think a lot of the arguments that he made in it are still interesting. And he said in an update to the article that electing Republicans is electing the exception that proves the rule, um, which is probably correct. And we certainly did see the same sort of thing that he was talking about in that article mirrored in many other countries, my own being one of them, of course, Canada. We still haven't shut down travel with anyone. I don't know why the Americans haven't shut down travel with us yet. Um, but yes, what the article was primarily about was the doctrine of internationalism and how this is such a strong belief in the minds of the political elite that they are not willing to abrogate it in any way. And that they're literally willing to let people die from this flu to uphold this notion. One of the sort of main arguments that was made, which I've heard other people make, that this isn't as necessarily unique to him, but he said that that shutting down travel, even for one country for one period of time, is showing that we can turn this globalism, internationalism, we can turn all of this around. And that all it takes is a couple of bureaucrats to say, stop it. A country is stopping this. Just it shows that it is actually possible in a sense to change this, even if there's no political will to actually do that. So it isn't just about I don't think anyone cares that much if you can't travel to China for a month or two, or even if you can't travel to Europe for a month or two. But when these travel restrictions are put in place, it helps wake people up a little bit that all these things that we've been experiencing from globalization and internationalism can be reversed relatively easily if the will was there.
Well, that was a really good summary. And yeah, like you said, it's interesting because the article sort of pretends to be about coronavirus initially, but it really isn't about the coronavirus at all. It's actually more about globalism, or as Moldbug calls it, internationalism, which is an interesting point in of itself, as well as the opposite of globalism, which is isolationism. So I assume you saw the U.S. Or President Trump at least banned travel from Europe, and I find that really interesting because it does demonstrate that we can actually put a stop to this idea of internationalism if we really had the will to do it. And I suspect there is some sort of ulterior motive along those lines in what he's doing. I think what happened yesterday evening was mostly part of the political theater to help the markets, to make the Democrats look bad, and probably in regards to the travel ban, sort of demonstrating the hypocrisy of Congress in terms of permitting this ban but not allowing certain others, for obvious reasons, right? It's obvious why they would accept the temporary European ban. Although
Yeah.
interesting that the UK is not included in that, and I was actually surprised. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I was surprised that Boris Johnson basically did absolutely nothing today. I don't know if you watched his conference, but the UK government is doing nothing, and I guess neither is yours. I suspected that Boris might close his borders because banning travel from continental Europe basically just means all of the airlines are going to route through the airports around London now into the United States. So that's pretty interesting. But yeah.
So the sort of main idea that Moldbug is getting at in this article is isolationism, or I'm probably going to pronounce this bad, but Sudoku, I don't know, Sudoku. Let's call it that.
Let me see. I think it's Neo Sakoku. Yeah.
Okay, that's probably it.
We'll go with that.
It for those of you who aren't aware, it's the period when Japan for like 300 years just cut itself off from the outside world completely. And I believe they had the death penalty for anyone that tried to break that, until, of course, Western ships forced that to change. But yeah, so that is the it's sort of a proposal that Moldbug lays out in this article, is for 1492 to be suspended, as he says, for the two hemispheres, the Western and Eastern Hemisphere, not North and South, to just be cut off completely from each other, or even more so, for each individual country to just be cut off completely from each other, from at least regular travel, if not all travel. And it's sort of obviously a bit of a ridiculous proposal, but that's kind of the point, and that's what he lays out, is that the idea that we could get into a world where every single country is closed off from each other, at least for regular travel, just indefinitely, seems insane. But the idea of relatively open borders almost everywhere is also pretty insane, and that's more or less what we have currently. If you would have proposed internationalism to any regular person 300 years ago, it would have just seemed insane. And I mean, 300 years ago, border controls didn't even really exist. I've talked about this before in the past, that like the reason that there wasn't a million Muslims in England 200 years ago wasn't because there was some sort of immigration law preventing it. It's because everyone just thought that would be a ridiculous thing to do. Before about the early 1900s, there were barely any official immigration controls anywhere in Western Europe. The idea of mass immigration was so repulsive and so obviously wrong that it just simply did not happen.
Well, yeah, and what are you going to do? You know, if you're a Spanish guy in the year 1600, are you going to just walk to Germany and go live in Germany where you don't speak German? That it wouldn't even make any sense.
Yeah.
But of course, you know, the modern person thinks, hey, I could, especially Americans, you know, thinks, hey, I could just go live in whatever country I want if I really wanted to, even if I don't speak the language.
Yes,
and that is an insane idea.
Yeah. And I mean, I've heard from many, often Americans, but, you know, just progressives in general, that will say that they do see it as some sort of inherent right to move anywhere in the world, that they think that that borders, they shouldn't restrict you in any sense, at least not in a broad sense. They might say, okay, you know, maybe they should be able to check if you have a criminal history, but beyond that, like they think people have some sort of inherent right to move anywhere. And that there should be at most minimal restrictions. And this is sort of the opinion of a small progressive elite. You know, I don't think your average Joe would be quite as extreme as that. But the point is the situation where we're at with open borders and internationalism currently, in the current year, is so insane compared to even just 50, 100, 200 years ago, that this idea of neo-sabuku, I'm not going to pronounce that right. I don't care. This is such an insane idea, but the point is laying out a vision for the future, that may seem very insane now, and we may never actually reach there, just as we haven't reached John Lennon's Imagine quite yet, here either, as close as we might get sometimes. But that's sort of, it's something that he's talked about in some of his other articles, sort of laying out a narrative for the future. So it's not necessarily about actually reaching the goal of having 200 different countries all completely closed off from each other. It's more about sort of laying out a sort of narrative for what a future goal could be.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you, I guess, sort of naively read, especially the Clear Pill, you can sort of get the sense that Moldbug is anti-narrative, but he really just wants to destroy all of the existing narratives and create a new one. He's not anti-narrative at all. He's actually very pro-narrative and seems to think that this is exactly what we need, some sort of positive, ideal, positive narrative to actually sell to people. I mean, in his podcast he did with Tech Wars, I don't know if you watched all of it or not, but he actually talked about someone literally needing to form a cult at some point in the future which is essentially what we have now. He doesn't mean that in any spooky way, but yeah, building a narrative is an essential element of getting past this clown world that I think pretty much everyone on the right is starting to realize, and we are trying to build that up now. So that was a very nice part of the article. I really like the end of the article actually the most, literally the last few sentences where he basically talks about how people really just need a dream, a big dream that matters, something that is an ideal in the future. And this is a really good way to get out of the sort of black-pilled mindset that a lot of people are in now. Even if it's some sort of crazy ideal that you kind of know deep down that will never be achieved, at the same time, you sort of have to have that kind of dream in your mind to completely oppose what exists, or else you're never actually going to be able to muster the resolve to get there, which is something he mentions as well in the article. Very good article.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I definitely it's somewhat long, but I definitely recommend everyone check it out. But yeah, so I don't really have anything else to add. Is there any other part of the article you'd like to focus in on?
Well, I think his idea of radical isolationism might be a bit much for me as an ideal. He points out that the people 100 years ago who were internationalists did they actually would have had literally the ideal of the state we're living in today is kind of their ideal, and it is a realistic ideal. I don't think people on the right, I mean, certainly some of them do, but I don't really think most people want this extreme isolationism in terms of literally no human being ever can go to any other country for any reason. I don't think that's really an ideal to me. That doesn't sound like an ideal world to me, especially in the West. I don't really think it would be ideal to have things taken that far and act as if we live in different galaxies, as he says, because there is something I think about Western people where we do enjoy going to each other's civilizations in some sense. At least modern people do. I guess that wouldn't be true of people 300 years ago, but we aren't people 300 years ago. We're people now. And as you mentioned in the podcast, you need to build an ideology for the material you're working with now. And even on the right, I don't think there is a desire for this hyper extreme isolationism. It's more of a desire to return to normalcy. And I think that is more of the ideal to aim for, something that we actually want rather than an ideal that I don't think most people would actually want. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think his isolationism is a bit kind of like extreme patchwork and a little too much for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. It seems it seems intentionally absurd to me.
Yeah, of course.
That seems to be his style in a lot of ways, with a lot of things. I would not want something like that. I mean, I don't know. I'm Catholic. I'm not even sure how that would work with like ordaining bishops and stuff if they can't leave. I know that's a weird thing to worry about.
Do it over Skype, I guess.
Yeah. But yeah. So I think it's intentionally absurd, and that isn't really a goal that I want. But I think it is an interesting thought experiment, at least.
It definitely is.
Yeah. I mean, also it'd be a pretty cool sci-fi novel if anyone wants to write that. 1492 being suspended. But yeah. So I think it's an interesting idea, but I don't think most people really want to go for it like full hog.
It is interesting, though, how he points out the possibility of unilateral isolation. It is a decision that any country can make at any point on its own without any others really having a say in it. Obviously, in terms of the United States, this kind of poses a problem. Like, if some random Middle Eastern country wanted to be isolated, we probably wouldn't really go for that. But if it was a European country, I think they could definitely pull that off if they really wanted to. So that's kind of a white pill, I suppose, in terms of if you can just muster the desire in one country to do something, you can actually pull it off. And I think Poland has done this to some extent in terms of refusing refugees and stuff. So that's a bit of a white pill, that idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat like medium to long term. Not isolationism this extreme, but a considerable amount of isolationism might be required in the European country, in certain European countries, in like parts of South and Eastern Europe, if things progress as they are currently. But another interesting part, a bit diverging from that topic in particular, from this article, is that he was talking about just kind of sort of like lab coat mentality is how people refer to it sometimes. Because he says, like, these people that what he was talking about was the big brain scientists that were saying that we absolutely shouldn't cut off travel, that quarantine isn't the right way to do this, and there's better ways to reduce virus spread than just having than just cutting off travel completely, and that's like barbaric and old, and that's not really the right thing to do. And he says correctly that these people, they'll have a stack of papers a mile high to prove these things, but they're obviously just wrong. Like I don't need like holy, like I don't care, like oh you have a study, like you're wrong, okay? It's like we get these things from these lab coats all the time. That they're like, I'm so smart, I have these papers that show that actually disease doesn't spread if you allow people to travel. But like until they can prove that disease can travel in a fish or something like that across the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, then you're just wrong, okay? I don't care what your studies say.
I'm adopting this mindset generally a lot more and more. Kind of ironically, I guess, because while Moldbug's radical measures kind of leave a bad taste in my mouth, but at the same time, I'm sort of taking equally as radical measures in my view of the universities and scientists, to where I kind of just want to reject everything they say that isn't obviously real, no matter what it is. I don't even care to look at it. Be it some goofy astrophysics stuff or just whatever. And, I'm trained as an engineer and as a scientist to some extent, but I'm at the point where I'm just kind of done with it all. I don't care what you people say. Just shut up, go back to your stupid lab and leave us alone. That's just kind of the state science is in now, where they've been so pervasively problematic that we just don't feel like putting up with anything they have to say anymore. We'd rather trust Chinese scientists than our own scientists, right?
Yeah. I mean, with things like that, where it's just like obviously incorrect. The presumption of the presumption of who's correct isn't with the scientist just because they're wearing a lab coat. The presumption it's the same thing that I had with the Styx porn stuff, where he's like, can we really know that porn is damaging? Like,
yes,
we have conflicting studies about this. Like,
my God.
you're right. If there's conflicting studies, they just throw up our hands. There's nothing we can do. No, we just have no clue.
I'm so tired of hearing about effing studies. I just don't care,
Yeah. So conclusion: science is fake and gay.
Yes.
But yes, so is there anything else from the article you'd like to discuss?
Let me check some of my notes. Let's see. The one other idea, I suppose, is I guess the idea of autarky. He didn't mention this specifically in the article, but I think the United States in particular is probably one of the few countries in the world that could basically pull this off with almost no real, even medium-term detriments to itself. I mean, probably within a span of 10 years, you could basically move all industry that's been exported back into the United States. And not only would we be self-sustaining in terms of energy and food, but even in terms of producing iPhones and all of that. And I really hope maybe, within our stint of pushing the reactionary way of thinking, we could actually see something like this happen. That's like my ideal, I think, is just getting what America does back in America and not in all of these other nations, both for their benefit and ours. Because as an American, I do really despise what America has done to the world in terms of this massive blending and just homogeneity, global homo. It's disgusting, and I just want us to back out of it. And it would be so, it's one of those things where there doesn't have to be some sort of, racial element to it, or even a purely economic element. It's just about having what we do in our own country. I think that's something really everyone can get behind, if you're a normie or on the right or left or whatever. It just seems like something that could really be achieved and would be really great to see actually happen.
I agree. I mean, this is probably a stupid point, but it is pretty much only thanks to China that we don't have gay characters in every single major movie.
Yeah.
So that is pretty based, but on the whole, it's probably bad. Um, but yeah, no, I agree. Let's see what else.
Yeah, I think that's about all I have to say on the article, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think I have some notes too, but I think we covered all the important parts. Um, one other just sort of small point that he did say that I thought was it kind of already covered somewhat, but I'd still like to mention. Is just like why scientists come to these just obviously incorrect conclusions. And one of the lines he says is pervasive error, a concept he talked in other articles about.
Yes.
Pervasive error affects everything. So it is like internationalism is a totalizing worldview. It affects everything. So pervasive error will affect everything. We can't have like it's like the feminist line: the personal is political. Virology is political. All this stuff is political. And there's no like decoupling it. So that's just the last point on the article I wanted to make.
Yeah, this idea of pervasive error actually reminds me of the Living Constitution. It's a neat explanation for why the cathedral's behaving as it does. You kind of have error building on error, building on error, just like you have Supreme Court precedents upon precedent upon precedent towards to where you end up in this completely ridiculous state of error. And you look and you try to figure out how you got here, and it doesn't really make any sense until you realize it's just this slow step-by-step process, and at every point on the way there was some particular reason where this small decision went this way in line with the totalitarian or totalizing ideology, internationalism, and it's a perfectly natural evolutionary process, really, rather than some massive all-at-once ideological reason.
Yeah. Also, just a little more that he said about it. Is that like as much as I was like ragging on lab coats back there, science does actually work sometimes, at least. As he says in the article, if science didn't work, your iPhone wouldn't work.
Right.
So it does work sometimes. But in a scientific community where there's a totalizing worldview, which there almost always is, whether that's communism or internationalism or something else, you can get points for having a correct scientific hypothesis, and you can get points for having an ideologically correct scientific hypothesis. And it doesn't really matter which is correct. Either of those can like earn you favor and promotions and stuff. So that's sort of where the pervasive error is built out of. Is people, honestly, sometimes they come to conclusions that are correct, and sometimes they come to conclusions that are politically correct. And those just build on top of each other.
Yeah, and one thing I found out too, kind of jumping off something you built there, is I feel like nuance is often a vector for leftist subversion, and I kind of feel like although we could make these distinctions about some science being okay or not okay, I kind of want to put the burden of the problem on the universities and scientists in general to sort themselves out, even if the fields have nothing to do with each other, just because I don't feel like we really have the bandwidth to deal with this problem. And also, I feel like if we do try to take this nuanced approach, we risk falling into their subversive traps in terms of what they actually get us to accept.
Yeah, no, I mean, anything coming from the left, from the universities, from the cathedral, should be looked on skeptically at the very least.
Yeah.
So I guess moving on to the interview now.
Or rather, I guess I would say rather than skepticism, the null hypothesis should just be that they're flat out wrong, and they have a high burden of proof to prove otherwise, regardless of what the topic is.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So moving on to the interview now. Is there anything in particular you wanted to talk about there?
Well, overall, the interview was pretty awesome. I liked it a lot more than the article. Not that the article was bad, but it's kind of interesting if you watch the whole interview, it's 2 hours and 23 minutes. I actually watched the whole thing twice so we could talk about it. And it's interesting to see Moldbug just chatting in his element, as opposed to bringing out these really long-form, well-developed ideas. Also interesting is it was kind of just as good as his blogs. I feel like if you kind of just wrote down his his train of thought, it would basically be like a Moldbug article. So that was kind of neat. But let's see. So one of the ideas he mentions in there, and I think this was when they were actually talking about the article, so this kind of relates to both, is that he talked about this idea of coded language marking you as either a friend or enemy, basically. And this is why he uses the term internationalization, internationalism as opposed to globalism, because internationalists, that's what they call themselves, and they view globalist as a slur. And it's really more to your benefit to actually refer to your opponent as what they really are, as opposed to coming up with these slurs that kind of make you look like Rush Limbaugh, I think was his analogy. And he's mentioned this in articles before, in terms of three-letter agencies. People say CIA, not the CIA in Washington, or EPA instead of the EPA. And I think it's useful to adopt this because if you are talking to someone who is potentially compromised or on the other side, it won't immediately mark you as a foe that they've been trained to be against. If you actually use their language, if you go up to leftists and start talking about globalism and all that, they're going to immediately know you're the enemy, and you won't be able to get anywhere with them. Or maybe if they're just a normie, maybe they think globalism is some right-wing conspiracy or something. But if you talk about it in terms of what the other side actually believes, internationalism, or what they use themselves, you can make a lot more progress in terms of not being immediately spotted out. And I think this is very useful to us as a sort of guerrilla movement to not bring an undue amount of attention to ourselves as we're trying to, I suppose, in our own way, employ a Gramscian strategy against them. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, totally. That's something I've tried to implement for a long time. It's much more useful to use the words people actually use for themselves than it is to use sort of slurs against them or whatever. There's lots of different examples of this. Progressive instead of SJW, that type of stuff. Where it just there are certain times in which it can be useful to use the slur version, but only really when you're talking among your own people. But even then, there isn't necessarily much of a use to it. But when you're trying to sort of infiltrate these places, not even necessarily infiltrate it, but when you're trying to talk with these people, if you use what is perceived as a slur, then they're just going to eject you. Even if not physically eject you, they're just going to know to ignore you. They're going to know that they don't have any use for you. So if you can know the language they use and use the right sort of language, you can get you can get interesting points in there. I've spent a significant amount of time in progressive communities in different ways, and I find it far easier to get sort of based reactionary points in by when I actually can use their language, and they might not even realize how based the point I'm making is. So you can actually be very subversive if you know how to use terminology correctly.
And I think there is even a use internally in not using the slur version of the language, because as he also mentions, being able to turn off the friend-enemy thinking is really useful in really thinking things through clearly, especially in terms of what the other side's motives are. Obviously, the left are enemies, right? But the ability to think of them not as that, as a sort of intellectual exercise, is really useful in really understanding them and figuring them out. So even in private, it's useful to actually think of them in this way in your own head.
Yeah, I agree. Another, if you're okay with moving on to a different part of that.
Sure,
now,
yeah.
Another part that I thought was interesting, I talked about in the interview a lot, was the sort of what I guess the distributors would call ghost dancing that is practiced in a lot
Yes.
of modern politics.
Yeah.
Where for those of you who are unaware, ghost dancing was a practice that Native Americans had, where they would they do these old ceremonies that used to work in the past, and they were doing them all the way up to their civilizations being destroyed, and they just couldn't get a handle of why this wasn't working now when it worked in the past. So he was talking about, like, for example, the street violence that we've seen in the past couple of years, where there's been, like, I don't know, 5 people that have died in like 5 years of street violence. That might be a slight under exaggeration, but not by much. But if you actually are looking at the the things that this is echoing, the early 1930s, you had hundreds of people a month dying sometimes. And it's one of the guys interviewing him quotes Marx for history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. And it's like this sort of street battles, the protests, stuff that we have. They're all obviously just farces. They're all obviously just cheap imitations of the real thing. Another good example is communism and fascism. Communism and fascism does not exist in the modern world at all, period. I don't know, maybe there's some old Nazi grandpa somewhere that's an actual fascist, but beyond that, it does not exist. Fascism and communism, in the sense that we originally understand it, is purely a result of World War I veterans. And we have people that like to LARP as these things sometimes. And we might be able to say we have neo-communism and neo-fascism, but these actual distinct political movements that existed at one period are relics of the past. And people they like to mirror them because they like to think, oh, if I mirror this, then maybe it will create something real. But it doesn't. These are things that exist in the past, and we don't have the materials to recreate them if we want to. It's actually really depressing sometimes seeing the actual internet, like revolutionary communists, where they actually think they're going to have their like great communist revolution at some point. Like communism's dead. Progressivism is communism now. The real big brain communists figured out that communism doesn't work, and social communism is the real successor to it. You're not going to get your actual communism ever.
Yeah, and Moldbug has some real disdain for these LARPers as well, and really so do I. It's so gay to see it happen. And this was probably the best part of the interview, though, where he went through all of these ideas. You really have to build a movement with the material you actually have, and not the material you're LARPing as or what you think you have. Because what we don't have is World War I veterans who are so accustomed to violence in a way that modern people will never be, that you can actually have these levels of street violence and it'll be effective. What we have now is meme warriors, and we're not gonna get up and go get our guns or whatever, my Second Amendment, and actually do anything. That's just not gonna happen. So thinking that way is just totally counterproductive, because it's just not a move we can actually make. And he references the whole like Virginia Boogaloo thing as if anything was going to happen there, and how you mentioned ghost dancing. I had forgotten about that Distributus video. That's actually a really good connection you made there. It is ghost dancing what these boomers were doing. Marching to the town hall or whatever. They had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea why they were demonstrating. As he said, what are you trying to demonstrate? All they demonstrated was that they were completely docile. They even cleaned up their own trash. Back in 100 years ago, maybe, or 200, whatever, people would have done this march. They would have walked into the government building, ejected the government, formed a new government, and implemented policy. Whereas the people in the march, maybe 1% of them had this in the back of their mind that they were going to do this, and even if they managed to take power, they have no idea what they would actually do. So it's all just this big play acting theater that amounts to nothing. They're only doing these demonstrations because people used to do it, and it used to be effective, but it isn't effective now, and we need to stop this and find some other way to be effective, some way to be effective with modern people, with meme warriors, and not LARPing as if we're gonna become the new brown shirts or something.
Yeah. I don't really have anything else to add to that point in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a blackpilling point, though, I guess, as you said, just because you kind of wish it was at least possible to do that. You kind of wish that we could organize this uprising against the machine and take them down. And the only reason we can't is just because they're just too powerful. But no, we don't even have the material to work with. We don't have the people on our side, including us right here, capable of doing this, that are actually going to see it through. So it's just kind of pointless to try and think about this. And that's the whole point of the clear pill, is we need to just dispense with all of this old narrative, all of this old stuff, fascism and communism, conservatism, etc. Just get it out of our minds and construct something entirely novel, although still a successor to these older ideas, but something that's actually novel and something that isn't just a husk. What we have now is a system of government that was designed for people who lived hundreds of years ago, and we're just going through the motions now, and that's just not a viable way forward for the West.
Yeah, no, it's I think it was from the interview, it might be somewhere else I'm thinking of this. But I think he quoted someone that said that expecting a system of government to work for everyone is expecting a tailor to be able to make a suit that fits everyone.
Yeah, I think he said that.
Yeah. But yes, my favorite part of the interview actually though was the end. He had a very colorful
analogy. With the black card.
Yeah.
That was good.
I don't think I'll be able to get through this without laughing. But what he said about democracy, about the whole system that we're working in currently, is that the sort of like boomer view of it, or the normie conservative view, is that this is an actual like coherent system that is more or less working as intended, but there's just some problems in it. The issue is that and that we realize that there's problems, and we just go back to normal. And what he said what Moldbug said it's like is if you're playing a soccer game, and you see if you're playing a soccer game and someone takes a fumble, and they and the referee comes and shows him a black card, and you're like, what is that? I've never seen a black card before. And he pulls out a gun and starts shooting people, and he just executes your team, and then you get back and you then you just get back and start playing the game again. Because your conclusion after that happens, after the referee just starts executing your team, should be whatever the hell's going on. It's not soccer. What we were told, what we thought this was supposed to be, it's not real. It's something completely different. But what happens with the normie cons is this happens that we have outrageous stuff that totally undermines the entire system, and they just get back to playing. That's the basis. That's what we need to understand, that this whole system doesn't actually work. Not the way they claim it does. It's like what I said in my most recent video, that it's not that democracy that doesn't like work very well. It's not that democracy doesn't produce the things we like. It's that democracy is a fraud to begin with. The actual concept of democracy never has existed. It's just an illusion that we're told.
Yeah, I laugh a little bit there just because it's really sad to see this happening, where people are still playing this game. I know people who still thought Yang and Sanders were gonna pull some sort of epic win on the Democrat side and fix things, and it's like you're playing checkers in this game, but you don't realize you're not playing checkers. You're actually in a game of 4D chess or something, and you're sitting here playing checkers. This is just the wrong game. You're not getting anywhere. It's literally impossible for you to progress towards your goals playing this different version of the game. Like in the soccer analogy, once you see that happen, going back to playing soccer is the wrong move. If a chunk of your team gets executed by the referee, and then you just go back to playing soccer like nothing happened, that's insane. But that's literally what conservatives and even normal people have done. Basically, is they're still just playing soccer while the cathedral is taking its Glock out on people.
Yeah, no, I think it's a perfect analogy. I'm probably going to use it many times in the future. Sorry, let me collect my thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's funny.
Yeah. But yes, so I mean, the point is that you really need to realize that, like, another good example of this, what she brought up, is a bias. Like, we have normie cons always constantly complaining about bias. Oh, they're biased. This is implying that the system, it's just kind of broken, and that there's some ideal we can shoot for. It's not supposed. The media wasn't created to deliver truth in the first place. None of this was created. It's not like bias, like. yes, the media is biased, but it's made to be biased. It's working as intended. The problem isn't that there's some kind of flaws in the system. The problem is that the entire system is corrupted by pervasive error to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. And from my perspective, I've pretty much ignored all of the primary stuff, except maybe enjoying a few memes here or there. But I just know so many people who actually pay attention to this, and what's the point? There's no point. You're just dumping your energy into nothing, trying to play this game that doesn't even exist. This story is really cool actually, because this was Moldbug sort of describing his own original red pilling moment. But yeah, the whole system is completely pervasively corrupt. There is no fix. There's no silver bullet. There's no massaging we could do to it that's gonna put things back into place, because really things were never in place to begin with. Like I was talking about checkers and chess earlier, we never even were playing checkers.
Yeah.
The 4D chess game was always there. You just didn't know it. Once you need to realize the higher levels of action that are being taken against you, and just completely break out of the paradigm. And again, that's what the clear pill is all about. It's not just some silly uber centrist type of thing where all ideologies are fake or something. It's not that. It's we need to get rid of all of this baggage from the 20th century and earlier, and really start thinking in different ways that actually work for us now, and work to build some sort of system that's completely divorced from this nonsense we have now, because it's nothing but nonsense. All of the elections in the West pretty much are pointless. And I mean, the current situation in the UK is a great example of that. The Conservative or Tory government is awful. Brexit was pushed through finally, and everything else they're going to do is probably going to be worse than Labour.
Yeah. No, I mean, I often bring this back to immigration, because it is, in a lot of senses, the sort of most pressing current issue. But I think immigration is the best way to show what a farce this whole concept of democracy is. Because if if the ruling class can literally just import a new demos, that's what democracy is supposed to be. It's the rule of the demos. If they can just, against the express will of the public, just import an entirely new demos, an entirely new voter base, then that's not just like things being slightly corrupt. Like you hear normie Republicans talk about this all the time. Oh, the Democrats are bringing in new vote stock. But that's not just like a small error. That's destroying the entire concept of democracy. And it's been like this for decades. It's been like this since Enoch Powell. You had 70-80% of the population that were on Enoch Powell's side, and you had the entire political class that was against him. And who won? The political class. And that's not, like, again, that's not doing the bad thing. That's why we have a political class. The problem is our political class sucks, and that we're in a fraudulent system.
Yeah, this reminds me of something Julius Evola talks about in Revolt Against the Modern World, when he talks about the disintegrating nature of modern individualism. We're supposed to live in this individualistic society, but what we really live in is a society in which people are just reduced to numbers and statistics, really. And that's why people have no problem with this idea, or the elites have no problem with this idea of just bringing in new numbers to replace the existing numbers, because all concept of individual personality has just been annihilated in modernity, and to some extent too by what people might call consumerism. Is people are just getting leveled into these individual units as opposed to actual people, and this is also something we really need to break out of. And this does relate to immigration. We need to recognize that Americans, the British, Japanese, whoever, they all do have their own individual personality as people and as nations, and that is really something to be respected, that people aren't these interchangeable units. That has to be utterly thrown away with.
Yeah, that another point from the article that Moldbug said, referencing Solzhenitsyn, another word I'm not pronouncing properly, but that nations are just like chipmunks, and just like any other thing in nature, nations are precious and unique entities. And when you mess with them, there's no getting them back wholly. Another thing which we didn't really directly mention with internationalism is we talk about how Beijing today is more like Boston in 1880 than it is like Beijing in 1880. So it's just this sort of leveling impulse that anything on the left has, but internationalism especially has had, which is what we're really fighting against, I guess.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of some interesting analogies there. If you go back far enough, this becomes easier to think about. Like let's say you just took the Roman Empire and you just replaced it with the Japanese. Do you think it would be the same at all? No, of course it wouldn't be the same at all. It'd be completely different, and that's because nations and people aren't just these swappable components. And yeah, of course, you basically mentioned the crux of the problem with globalism. There is that modern Japan is in no way modern Japan, and same for modern China or South Korea. They're just versions of the West with some actually authentic and to some extent Asian flair to it. So Japan is like Japan is like the West Coast of the United States with a little bit more Japanese elements to it, and then South Korea is the same thing. And this is wretched and disgusting, honestly.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to talk about?
Let's see. Let me look at some of the notes I have. One of the funniest things he said in the discussion was just on the idea of fans. He talked about how the best way to have a really good long-term fan base is to be as antagonistic to your fans as possible, which I thought was just pretty funny.
Yes.
I definitely feel like
I'm of course sure everyone watching this is top quality fans. But if you aren't, get out of here. But subscribe anyways.
Another funny thing in the article was when they were talking about they talked about Inception a bit, and just how this was when they were talking about the material differences in people. That if you showed someone from 100 years ago the movie Inception, they wouldn't even be able to understand it. These realities within realities and the quick editing, but a modern person just has absolutely no problem with this. And then likewise, if you put a modern person in the trenches of World War I, their heads would just explode, perhaps literally. And this is the thing we need to realize in terms of building a movement, that we really do have fundamentally different people, and we need to get rid of all of this LARPing element. It just it's completely not useful at all. And
yeah,
I can't believe it's still around. It just gets so annoying. You just see it everywhere. It's like, why won't they just go away?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like what I was talking about before. It's ghost dancing. It's I know people, if they had swords or black shirts or something like that before, that gave them power. So maybe if we do that enough now, it will give us power.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Another interesting idea too was this idea of running a cult with admissions control, which is something the right has been really, really bad at. For anytime you're running a serious political movement, there's actually criteria for membership. You can't just become a member of the party. You have to actually fulfill the requirements, and you can even be ejected from the party. And at some point, we have to start doing that. And I know some communities do this to some extent, where we don't just let in anybody. We don't care about your free speech. Go do it somewhere else. We don't care. In our movement, we're going to have certain criteria for actually being a member of it. So at some point, we're going to have to really enforce those even more and more strictly to keep the LARPers and other bad elements out.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, that's probably all I can think of at the moment to really say on these two things. Definitely good stuff as usual by Moldbug. Very definitely recommend both the podcast and the article.
Yeah. I guess one last thing related to this. I thought it would be fun if we could end by sharing what our red pill moments were, as Moldbug went over that. So would you like to start with that? Or?
Yeah, well, I mean, mine literally was the open letter, which is why I kind of reoriented my channel towards Moldbug, because I've actually told this story before a long time ago with Argent Templar, I think, but it's kind of funny. I was planning a trip to Washington D.C. I was in my like mega patriotic mode, back in 2017, and so I was going to do like this pilgrimage to Washington D.C. I'd never really taken many vacations on my own, and like a month before I went, I read the open letter, and it just completely blew my mind and turned the trip into something completely different. It felt more like as I was just kind of walking around the National Mall, it felt like kind of walking through, like, if you were walking through the ashes of ancient Rome, or like a facsimile of it. Like this thing is dead, but all of the trappings are still here, and that was a really interesting way to tour the city. So yeah, it was really just Moldbug. I read the open letter, and it just completely made sense of everything I had seen happen over the last like 2 years with Trump and Gamergate and all that. And there was really no ingestion time for me. It's like I read it and I was instantly just convinced, because I had just never encountered anything like this before in terms of explaining what was actually going on. And I think that's actually pretty similar to what Moldbug went through, where at the end of the show, he describes the situation where there was kind of just this one moment where everything just kind of clicked for him, and the whole illusion just dropped all at once. So that was basically it for me. It was the open letter. So I expect your story might be similar, actually, in terms of the instantaneous nature of becoming red pilled. It's kind of creepy.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's actually almost the same, and I mean, it really, the main point was the open letter too for me. But yeah, I mean, it was gradual and then sudden, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
There had been multiple points, and I started to be disillusioned with democracy a bit, which was weird because I mean, I was a neocon in high school. I was some weird mix between neocon and libertarian, which I guess is how most neocons are. So I loved democracy. I was like, I want everyone to have a democracy. But then I had started to become, after high school, I started to become disillusioned with it more and more. And I wasn't like super disillusioned with it. But I did start to get disillusioned by it. And then I read the open letter. I don't even remember. I'm pretty sure the Distributist had mentioned it. Is probably where I heard it from. But I read it, and it's very readable. I read through the entire thing in a few days. And I was just like, I don't know, I don't want to swear, but I was just like, damn, this just okay, everything I believed in before is kind of just fake. And there were a lot of things that kind of took me to get to that point. But once you sort of realized that, it really sort of just shatters your confidence in everything. So it was a very similar story. Also, I'm a lot of sort of other things. The sort of state of Canada is a really black-pilling thing. I mean, like, for instance, right now we have the leadership contest for the Conservative Party of Canada, and I barely follow it, but I do follow it a little bit. And the two leading candidates, one is the moderate, who says he'll march in gay pride parades no matter what, and just he loves sodomy and all that stuff. And the other guy says he'll march in gay pride parades and he loves sodomy, but only if they allow cops to march in them too. And that's the based blue Tory. So it's just like, seeing that type of stuff happen, seeing the like constant will of the electorate being constantly ignored, sort of is what helped to get me to that point.
Yeah, it's funny too, because when I got to that point, I was already making YouTube videos and stuff. I had like a couple hundred subs, and they were kind of normie conservative videos, I guess, classical lib maybe. And so I watched a lot of videos. Like I don't remember who was popular back then on YouTube, but I was watching generally the kind of right wing on YouTube. And so after I read the open letter, I was like, oh man, this was awesome. I need to go see what people are saying about this. And so I was looking for Moldbug videos, and there were literally none on YouTube. And I was like, what's going on here? So I was like, well, I'll just make the videos. And so that turned out to be pretty successful, actually. So very happy that a lot of people have gotten positive exposure to Moldbug through my channel, because that's literally exactly what I set out to do very specifically, because it was frustrating to me that nobody was talking about these ideas that had such an immense effect on how I viewed the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, so I don't think I really have anything else, unless you have anything you want to end on.
Nah, I think that was a good ending point right there, actually.
Okay.
Thanks for asking that question. I always find, I think everyone finds that an interesting question to ask people on the rate.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks everyone. Please subscribe to my channel, and also please subscribe to Charlemagne's channel if you haven't yet. And yeah, thanks everyone very much for watching, and bye.
Bye bye.